This is Resolute and the Resolute Podcast, where we are discipling and developing men to live with conviction. I am Vince Miller, your host, and today we're still in a series entitled Leadership Skills. We are in Lesson 5, which is margin. Welcome back to the program. If this is your first time tuning in, then thanks for joining us. The Resolute Podcast is produced multiple times every week. We have Resolute study guides that go along with this podcast for your men's group, found on the website for members at beresolute.org. Come back often. Feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or in iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. All the links are on the homepage of the website. Please go there, visit it, check it out, and let's dive in. Well, today we're in the 5th lesson of 9, and we are developing leadership skills that I believe will aid us in becoming more proficient in our leadership. Today we're discussing the topic of margin, the one thing many of us have in tiny, tiny quantities. And if you've ever had one of those moments where you've longed for a simpler and slower pace of life on a desert island, then you know exactly what I'm referencing. Isn't it interesting how life can, so quickly get out of control for us? Projects, children, events, travel, work, education all stack up after a while, don't they? Just keep stacking on and on and on. And as we keep adding things in, all of our margins are depleted. As a result, we are not left with more accomplishment, but feelings of fatigue, less drive, increased anxiety, and this internal brokenness. No wonder we want to escape to a desert island. In my home, actually I'm sitting in my office here, I usually plug in a heater and occasionally a circuit breaker will trip. I'm sure this has happened to us all. We've had too many electrical items plugged in and snap, a breaker blows. And why? Well, an electrical loop breaks because we have too many devices running at one time. This overload causes your electrical lines to heat, which trips a circuit. And overheated wires in the wall are not a good thing because they lead to fires. And while we might think it a little bit of a hassle to go reset the circuit on that line, the breaker box is communicating to us is what it's doing. It reveals to us wires are overheating and will lead to greater damage if we do not, quote unquote, give it a break. We got to give it a break. And this principle is true for us as well. Often we don't see that we have depleted margin and that our lives are overheating. Depleted margin leads to circuit breaks, which are often unseen in our life until we experience catastrophic failure or damage. Been there? The only way sometimes to get some of us to slow down is for things to completely fall apart. But remember, we're not talking about a house here. We're talking about our life and those around us. All of us lacking from margin. And please hear this. Failing to lead ourselves is a failure in leadership. Gentlemen, failure to lead yourself is a failure in your leadership. If we cannot lead ourselves, we will not be able to lead anyone, so we have to get a handle on this. This is why today we're going to understand how to build margin into our life with the outcome of structuring maybe a better week that leaves us with, more margin, maybe. I don't know about you, but I have many weeks where there are a lot of urgent things going on. Urgent matters that are, literally I have to deal with like right now. And, I'll tell you, the underlying values and beliefs that drive this reasoning are really the issue. That there's some sort of thought that we've attached to our mind and soul regarding the urgency of that particular matter. Most of the time, it's that we have an ego on the inside that is a monster that wants to preserve itself, right? There's a bunch of underlying values and beliefs, but often we do this because we're trying to self-preserve. We get all worked up. Everything becomes urgent. We lose our margin because we're trying to preserve the self. And if you want to understand why underlying values and beliefs drive our reasoning, just go back to our lessons from the last section on values and beliefs, and go back many sections to belief systems. We may not speak about these values that are driving our behavior, and we may not even be conscious of them, but they do direct our behavior. I'm guilty of this. I have had days and even weeks in my life that leave me feeling overwhelmed. And too much of this results in handling even small tasks poorly. It also leads to other issues for me, like increased anxiety, poor eating patterns, sleepless nights. Have you been there? You've got your own indicators. Those are mine. And we've all been here. We all have. But we got to figure out how to address this matter, right? Margin. So today's text is from Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. It's a scene. It's a narrative. It's a beautiful scene. So just let me read it for you. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that had been done and that they had taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." Now, you have to understand that the disciples have just been out on a mission, and now they're coming back, and Jesus is encouraging them to get some R&R, right? And then it says, "For many were coming and going. They had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns. And then they got there ahead of them." This is crazy. "When they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered them," that's Jesus answered them. He said, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups, hundreds by hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and all the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Okay, we know the story. It's a very familiar story, and it's the feeding of the 5,000, which appears in all the Gospels because it's such a remarkable story. Now, I want you to, for a moment, if you can, to just imagine what this would have been like for the disciples. I want you to imagine the scene. You got this beautiful moment on the lake. The disciples have just come back from a mission. They're escaping to a place where they can find a reprieve. The disciples and Jesus had just had an exceedingly busy day, probably just as busy as we feel sometimes. In fact, they were so involved in their work that they forgot to eat. Have you been there? Probably numerous times. I know I have. For sure. But even after realizing they need some food and a break, the crowd will not let them have the required margin. The disciples grab a boat in an attempt to get away, and yet they're unsuccessful, and as they leave, the crowd continues to chase after them. In the text, they sound like this pack of hungry dogs chasing down their next meal. And as the disciples land on shore, there's a crowd of people waiting for them, and not a few, but thousands. Thousands. Many have estimated between 5,000 and 15,000 men, women, and children. While the disciples were looking for a reprieve, this does not sound like the desolate place they had their minds set on. I wonder if it felt anything like one of those mad rushes of customers waiting at Walmart on the morning of Black Friday, right after Thanksgiving. Can you imagine that moment? I bet it looks like that moment. And yet, at this moment, Jesus continues to provide out of the compassion of his heart. But notice this activity. It continues for an entire day, a day full of teaching and ministry and more work. And as night falls, they've got to be exhausted. And I mean everyone, the crowd, Jesus, and the disciples. And you can almost hear the irritability in the disciples' tone as they inquire of Jesus about food for the group. In this moment of exhaustion, Jesus performs one of his great miracles. We get his best in this moment. Jesus provides not only margin, but sustenance to go with the margin in the middle of exhaustion, hunger, and busyness. You know, I remember years ago meeting Dr. Richard Swenson. He wrote a book entitled Margin, the same title, and he said this in his book. He said, margin is the space between our load and our limits. It is the amount allowed beyond that which is needed. It is something held in reserve for contingencies or unanticipated situations. Margin is the gap between rest and exhaustion, the space between breathing freely and suffocating. Margin is the opposite of overload. If we're overloaded, we have no margin. Most people are not quite sure when they pass from margin to overload. Oh man, is he right? It's like living a life without a breaker box, right? That's exactly what he's like. I think Dr. Swenson is spot on here. We are often not quite sure when we have crossed from our allocated margin to excessive overload in our life, are we? I know I'm not. You know, I remember years ago hearing him speak at a retreat I attended. He illustrated all this using a rubber band, and he picked it up and explained that a little stress is good because stress helps us to function more efficiently. He kind of pulled gently on the rubber band. But there are other times when the stress becomes too much and it depletes our margin, and so he pulls the rubber band way out, right, where it's testing our margins. He says, these are the events that test our marginal limits. He called this the gap between our load and our limits. And then he said, if we exceed our limits, we snap. And then he broke the rubber band. I'll never forget that illustration as long as I live, because we've all lived in that moment. We've all been there. You know, Stephen Covey had this time grid years ago. I remember it. It was a time grid which kind of marks off things that are urgent and important and not urgent and important and very urgent and important. It's a Yohari window with 4 boxes, so a four window grid. And he essentially teaches a person how to categorize the matters of life. You know, often I think in this little matrix here that Stephen Covey gives us as a tool that there's way too many things in the very urgent and very important box, right? We got way too many things overloaded there. What's interesting is if you engage in that behavior of actually writing some of these things down, you're going to discover that you probably do, like you probably do today. You probably have way too many things in the very urgent, very important box. And what's crazy about it is if you start to really fill in the box, you realize that other people have their time grid as well. They have matters to them that are very urgent and very important. And sometimes those people project those things onto us, like our employers and our spouse and the people around us. Sometimes our kids do this to us, right? They have very urgent and very important matters that they want dealt with right now. Dad, come pick me up right now. I need to ride somewhere right now. You ever been in that moment? No wonder we're overloaded. Not only do we have too many things in our very urgent and very important box, but other people are giving us their monkeys from their back, and we overload, right? Wow. No wonder this all stacks up. What we need to do is figure out how to become more efficient at not letting this build up so much that it hijacks our margin and leads us into that moment we snap a breaker. And you know what it involves. When you snap a breaker, you snap it in your unique way, and I do in my way. Maybe you have outbursts of anger. Other people retreat to food. Other people retreat to just losing it, whatever it might be for you. I don't know. But we have to effectively build margin into our life. You know what would be good for you? The same thing that Jesus was encouraging his disciples to do is to build some margin in. It's really simple. to just build it into your life. I would encourage you to pull out a calendar, to look at that calendar and to plan your ideal week. What it would actually look like. Don't take everything off of it. Just plan your ideal week. What does it look like? Work, play. What does assignments look like and homework? When does social things come in and extracurricular? When do you eat? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. How do you have space for reading God's word, engaging in devotion? How do you do those things? Mark them out on a paper. Figure out your space between your load and your limits, because without margin, gentlemen, you will not be an effective leader, I promise you. Well, guys, that's the show. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed our time today, because I enjoyed it with you. And of course, I'm hoping that you'll pass along this podcast to other men you know that maybe need some margin in their life. Just head to our website for the app, or simply share this feed. Also, I want to encourage you to head to our website and grab a couple tools. First, there's the Men's Daily Devo on our website. Love you to grab that. You can get that in your email box, and the Men's Weekly Podcast. I know I do this numerous times a week, but you can have it delivered to you if you like. And you can sign up for both of those things with the buttons on the top of our webpage at beresolute.org. I'd love to have put these tools in your hand, because I know that they'll help you to be more effective at life and to create deeper devotion and challenge for you as a man of God. So guys, I love you. Don't forget it. Get off the bench. Get into the game, and I'll see you right back here next time on our next edition of the Resolute Podcast.